Finalmente siamo giunti ad un momento che ci avete fatto capire che è quello che aspettavate, perché insomma gli appassionati di modulari sanno chi è il nostro prossimo ospite. Adesso lo introduciamo, è Chris Meyer di Learning Modular, una piattaforma di corsi dedicati al mondo modulare. Tra l'altro seguite la pagina di Chris sul nostro sito perché ci sono degli sconti attivi proprio in questi 2 giorni per i suoi corsi. Faccio entrare l'ospite. Ciao Chris.
Ciao.
Perfetto, direi che l'audio funziona. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I hope everyone has been enjoying Soundmit so far today.
Okay.
Yeah, we're enjoying it. Hello, Chris. I'm very happy to meet you here. So you could attend our version of Soundmit in our digital way this year. And I would like to ask you a question, if possible.
Yes. Yes.
What can you explain to the whole audience about your masterclass?
Yeah. In general, I love to play with modular synthesizers because I'm trying to find ways to go beyond the normal synthesizer voice that's in most keyboards. So I've been playing with different ways of changing the normal patch we use in synthesizers to see if there's small changes we can make to get a lot more sounds, or at least different sounds out of it. And lately,
you can even customize it, right?
Yes, customize it. I'm always trying to find a way to get, for example, different waveforms for the oscillator and for the LFO, so we can get some different sounds out of the instrument. And I've been playing around with what I found is a simple technique. It only requires maybe changing one module that has opened up a new range of sounds, and I want to step through that step by step and explain to people how to recreate it on their own.
Well, there are a lot of features, I guess. So if there are any questions, I would like to ask you to the audience so they can maybe give you some questions and you can answer them in the final part of our Soundmit. So we can just gather them up and give you everything we got about these questions.
Sounds good to me.
Fine.
Shall we get started?
Yeah, I guess we can start.
Okay, I'll switch over to the synthesizer. So the normal synthesizer voice takes several different oscillators. For example, I have a couple different ones in my case here, mixes them together, then passes them through a filter and then through a VCA. And I've been playing around with one simple change, is what if you took the mixer between the oscillators and the filter and replaced it with a crossfader instead? What new options does that open up to create some different sounds or some different waveforms? So I'm going to be using the next hour to explore that idea, mainly with oscillators, but at the end a little bit with LFOs as well. I'm going to start very simple with just one VCO and what different sounds can we get out of that, and then just keep expanding and expanding to see how much further we can go with that. So I'm going to be focusing on this section for most of this video, although I will also be using the mother and some other oscillators. So let's give you a closer look at what I'm doing down here. And I'm going to be using this oscilloscope to show you the different waveforms coming in and going out. For example, I'm going to start with one oscillator, this spectrum from WMD SSF. I'm going to take a very simple waveform such as a sine wave, make that the green trace on the scope so you can see it, and I'm going to put that into one side of my crossfader module. I'm using a Happy Nerding dual X fade, but you could use almost any analog crossfader. It will work just as well. I'm going to take another waveform, something we all know, such as the sawtooth wave, and make that the second waveform. There we go. I'm actually going to use a longer patch cable for that because I know I'm going to be repatching this for the next hour. And we're going to put that into the other side of our crossfader. Then we're going to take the output of our crossfader and send it on to the Moog so you can hear things. So the yellow trace is the mixture of these two different waveforms. And I'll go ahead and turn on my synthesizer. I can crossfade between the simple sine wave that's on one input or the sawtooth on the other. And come up with in-between waveforms. Well, the idea of using a crossfader instead of a mixer is so that you can dynamically change the mix between the waveforms. So let's go ahead and turn this down a little bit so it doesn't kill your ears. Use something like an LFO to change the crossfade between the two. You can use very slow LFOs for very slow evolution, or very fast ones. And now we're starting to hear some sounds we do not normally hear just mixing together oscillators. There we go. And we're going to be exploring that idea of crazier sounds a little bit later on, but I just want to give you a taste of where we're going with that. So an LFO is one approach. Another idea is to go ahead and use an envelope generator to change that crossfade for every note that we play. So let's go ahead and take our crossfade voltage instead as an output from an envelope generator, so that when I play a note on my keyboard, I'll get a dynamic change between them. I'll start with a sine wave and have the envelope go to the sawtooth. At this point, I'm not even using any filter, so I'm using just the timbre change of the oscillators to do the job of maybe what a filter would normally do. And of course, you can always add in filter to that patch. So that's some very simple things of using a crossfader to dynamically change the mix between your oscillator waveforms. But what gets even more interesting is what if you used another oscillator waveform to change the mix, so that you're changing the crossfade in between the waveforms at an audio rate. Now this is a type of synthesis that is starting to appear in a few modules. You might see something called a window transform synthesis or a wave splice synthesis. What they're using is a very simple switcher to say use one waveform, then use another part of the waveform, and go back and forth between two different waveforms, splicing them together. And we can recreate that very easily by using, let's go ahead and use different patch cables, something such as a pulse wave to decide our mixture between the two waveforms. So that red or that pink display is our pulse wave out from the same oscillator. And we're going to use that to now do our crossfade. And again, the yellow is the combination between the two. So now we have a sine wave for half of a cycle, and then a sawtooth wave for the other half of a cycle. If we change the pulse width, we change the mixture of how much of each waveform we're using. All sine wave, or all sawtooth wave. So already we're now getting more sounds and wave types than we normally get from our normal oscillator. We could just use this as a steady mix and choose a waveform that we like. And if we want, just use that for a normal patch and play with the filter. But we could also modulate that pulse width to change the mix dynamically in between our two waveforms. So I'll get our LFO again here. I'll patch that into the pulse width. And add some filter if we want to. Maybe speed up the LFO, or make it a very slow change. So this is kind of like the ability to add pulse width modulation to any waveform or any mixture of waveforms by changing the splice point in between them. So that's kind of fun to be able to do that, to splice together multiple waveforms. But so far, I'm using just one oscillator. So all of these are in tune with each other, so that we're just mixing together different waveforms that they all have the same pitch. We can keep extending this technique by now introducing other oscillators that can be maybe tuned differently from each other or detuned to drift. I'm going to take my pulse width modulation out for now. So it's just a steady waveform. And instead of taking the sawtooth from the spectrum, instead I'm going to take it from my mother 32 up here. As you can see from the way the waveform's drifting, they're slightly out of tune with each other. Again, the yellow is our output waveform. We're taking part of the green waveform, the sine wave from the spectrum, part of the blue waveform, the sawtooth from the mother, and switching between them using the pulse width out of the spectrum, which is our red waveform. Again, I can change the mix. I can add pulse width modulation. Or I can change the tuning of the mother itself. Right now it has a slow detune. I can have more detune. I can change octaves. Up higher. Again higher. Or even choose a musical interval like a fifth. Again, I'm playing around with the filter to add some change. The raw sounds like this. So that's the type of sounds we get when we splice together two different waveforms. We can also play with how fast we're splicing between them. Let's say that we just go back to our nice simple sawtooth and sine wave, both coming from the same oscillator. So they're perfectly in tune. But now we take the control for our crossfader, that splice, and take that from the mother, which can be tuned differently. I'm going to take this out of the pulse wave of the spectrum, take it up to the pulse wave of the mother 32. Again, the red or pink is the switch between the waveforms. And again, we get a lot more motion in the sound. I can add pulse width modulation. Or retune how fast I'm switching between them. Going down an octave is very nice, for example. Or go up a few octaves. Take it back down to as close to unison. So already, now with two oscillators, we're getting a much wider range of timbres than we normally get if we just have one oscillator or maybe just a mixer. But we can keep going from here. So right now I'm using the spectrum for the sine wave. I could change this to use, say, the mother for the sawtooth wave, and then use a third oscillator. For example, I have a disting here with a square wave output, and use the third oscillator, which can be tuned differently again, to go ahead and be, whoops, I've got these patched a little bit differently here. Let me get this correct. The sawtooth from the mother, sine wave from the spectrum, and then the switch, the square wave, from the disting. So now we have three oscillators, and all of them detuning will create all these phasing relationships. I can tune the mother to be a fifth compared to the spectrum. I can go ahead and change the octaves on our splice oscillator. or go down low. And again, that's not using filter yet. Of course, we can use the normal part of our synthesizer to filter the sound. So that's a pretty rich sound. Now, so far, we've been using the crossfader in a very simple way. We've just been saying, use part of one waveform, then switch and use a different part of a waveform. But the result of that is we have this little bit of a glitch, particularly when the sawtooth crosses that splice point. You'll hear a sudden change in the timbre. Go down to the... And that's a type of effect you hear from many of these so-called wave splicing or the window transform type oscillators that are currently available. However, since we're using a crossfader, we don't need to use a hard switch, one or the other. We can use it to blend in between the waveforms, but do it at an audio rate by using another oscillator. So instead of using a square wave out of my third oscillator, the distinct, I'm going to use a triangle wave out of it. And now we have a much smoother blend. We no longer have that really hard glitch at the switch point. We have something smoother going on because the red waveform, the triangle, is crossfading between the two waves. And still, we can detune things if we want. Now, it so happens that this triangle wave out of the distinct, which I'm using to crossfade between the two different waveforms here, does have a variable wave shape. So not only can I use another oscillator waveform to crossfade at audio rate between two sources, I can go ahead and modulate the crossfade. So we keep getting richer and richer, more and more things we can do with this patch. So I'm going to go ahead and take our little LFO here, and instead run that to the wave shape on the distinct. So it'll go between a sawtooth and a triangle wave. I can slow it down for a very slow temporal change. Or speed it up for something crazier. If I want to change how deep it's modulating, I just need to put it through an attenuator to reduce the depth of the modulation. So maybe it's just a small addition to the patch. And again, I'm going a little bit crazy here. I'm using 3 different oscillators, 2 for my source waveforms, green and blue, and a third oscillator to do the crossfade. But you can scale this patch up and down depending on how many oscillators you have. Say you only had 2 oscillators, the spectrum and the distinct. I could say, well, I decide to take both the sawtooth and the sine wave from one oscillator and then crossfade between them using this second oscillator. And then if I want to filter between, filter it. So that's one approach. we can go ahead and combine these different oscillators. But so far, I've only been using very simple waveforms. Sawtooth wave, sine wave, square wave, triangle wave. If you have a more complex oscillator, such as a wavetable oscillator, you can make that part of this mix as well to again create a more complex mix. So let's go ahead and simplify a little bit, then build back up so you can hear the changes. I'm going to take the crossfade out for now. Let's just leave that with no modulation so it's very steady. I'm going to take one of my waveforms from the wavetable oscillator, the blue waveform you see now, and still take my sine wave from the spectrum. And if I remove the crossfade input, I can manually crossfade between them. Sine wave to my wavetable. I'll turn up my filter. I can go ahead and modulate that crossfade the same way I did before, using an envelope, using an LFO, or using another oscillator to change the crossfade. Or most wavetable oscillators allow you to change their wave shape as well. So you can go ahead and dynamically change the wave shape of that oscillator. Oops. You can use an envelope generator, or maybe I could use another LFO to do that. And again, that's more complex than just mixing the waveforms together straight, or even just modulating just the wavetable on its own. And the wavetable oscillator, of course, could be patched anywhere in here. I'm using it as one of my source waveforms, sine or the wavetable, but I could change around again and use something very simple for the blue waveform, such as, well, we'll just go back to our very simple sawtooth wave, and instead take my modulation from the wavetable oscillator and crossfade in between two waveforms using a wavetable. And I can use different wave shapes for my source oscillator, such as a suboctave, mix between those. And again, that's without filter. I can still use the rest of my synthesizer to make the sound more interesting, for example, with an envelope filter. So before I move on to using LFOs as well with this, I think this might be a good time to stop briefly, or long if you have questions, to see if anyone had any questions on this basic idea or wanted to try out a different idea with this, where I'm just saying, take your oscillators and instead of mixing them, crossfade and modulate the crossfade with an envelope, with an LFO, or even better, with another oscillator to create these rich sounds. Any questions or anything you want explained a bit better about that, or? Silence from our hosts in Italy. They must be stunned by these sounds. Okay, if there's no questions, we can keep going. So I'm using this to mix oscillators, mainly because I'm got a little bored with having the same waveforms over and over again from my oscillators. But you can use a similar idea to mix between LFO wave shapes and create a more interesting LFO than just a simple triangle wave. So I'm going to simplify this patch back down to a simple timbre we can recognize, and then start adding LFOs into this mix. So right now this is a little bit crazy. I'll open up the filter cutoff. I'm going to take the wavetable oscillator out of here for now, just because it was adding a bit of a strangeness to the whole thing, making a very complex sound. And instead, now we have a suboctave and a sine wave from the spectrum. I can manually fade between them. Sine wave or suboctave square wave. As I showed earlier, I could use an LFO to modulate the crossfade between those. And most LFOs, like the individual outputs from the DivKid Instro Oct or from the Mother 32, are just simple triangle waves. So let's go ahead and get our triangle wave LFO here and use that instead to be our modulation that crossfades between these two waveforms. It's a simple triangle wave. The pink line is showing the current level of the LFO, and then the yellow is the output mix that is a result of crossfading. Well, most LFOs have that simple periodic go to one extreme, go back to the other extreme, keep repeating, and I personally find those can get a bit boring somewhat quickly. What if we use this same technique to crossfade between multiple LFOs to now create a more complex waveform? For example, the Oct gives me 8 different LFO speeds from one module, so that's a good thing to use for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one output from the Oct, put it into one input of this second crossfader I have down here, take a second output from Oct, put it into the other side of my second crossfader, then take the output of the crossfader and use that to modulate my waveforms. I can pick just one LFO wave or the other LFO wave, just slower, or a mixture between the two. And by mixing two LFOs at different rates, now you have a more complex pattern. I can pick a faster LFO to mix with. Or a slower one. So now we have something a little less repetitive, and for me, less boring than just a simple LFO waveform. And I joke that I have an attitude towards synth patches like DJs have about the dance floor. You don't want to leave something silent for too long or the same for too long because people will get bored. But if you keep changing things up, that keeps people interested. I like to keep changing up things like my waveforms. So what if we crossfaded between the two LFOs using a third LFO to constantly vary that mix in between them? And I'll change the time base here so you can see what's going on with the LFOs. The yellow wave shape is the output waveform. The pink is the LFO output. Now we have an LFO waveform that seems to be much more random rather than just a simple repetitive back and forth. And we can use a more complex LFO like that anywhere in our synth patch. We could use it to modulate the filter cutoff. We could use it to modulate pulse width modulation. I'm using it to mix between our oscillators in a more random and unpredictable way. But since it's still a normal LFO, I can still change the rate of everything to be slow or very fast. So that's the core of what I wanted to present, is just this idea of replace a mixer in your synth with a crossfader in between. And then rather than just dialing in a mix of waveforms that you're happy with, or picking one LFO waveform that you're happy with, instead experiment with dynamically changing the mix between your oscillator waveforms, or dynamically mixing between different LFO wave shapes to create a more animated waveform that's a composite of what you're feeding into it. And for me, that adds more animation and more life to a patch with a relatively simple change. It's not requiring you to get a whole new synthesizer. It's not requiring a very expensive module. Crossfaders are one of the less expensive modules you can get for your system, but it opens up the door to a whole bunch of new sounds beyond what you were normally getting from your oscillators and your LFOs. Let's see. I don't hear our Italian hosts, unfortunately. I do not hear their microphones, but I at least can read the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and read the chat and answer some questions here. And go ahead and say hi to some people as well again. Good to see you again. Trovarsi was asking, can you do this with a WMD module, the Axis? Yes, you can. The Axis is another example of a stereo crossfader module. It does have sort of an exaggerated crossfade pattern, so it's going to give you a little bit different shape than a normal straight crossfader, but that's just a slightly different timbre, slightly different wave shape. I've had great success using any analog crossfader so far. For that matter, the Mother 32 actually has a voltage-controlled crossfader built into it. It's the mix knob up here. The mix control actually has a CV input, so you can use the same technique by just adding one more oscillator to a Mother and patching it to the mix to dynamically go between the waveforms already inside the Mother. However, I have had trouble using digital crossfaders. There's some modules, like the mutable instrument warps, which are very, very flexible, but when you start trying to crossfade at audio rates, you're getting into the limit of maybe how fast a digital module is reading its inputs, and you might start getting some strange artifacts in the crossfade. It may be an interesting sound. Artifacts create a lot of really fun sounds in modular synths, but if you want things to make sense from the beginning, I would start with an analog crossfader, and something like the WMD Axis will work fine. And then maybe start experimenting with other modules you have in place of the crossfader, such as ring modulators, things like that, to get more interesting sounds. Yes, I see Trovarsi answer. Oh, Analog Kid answered Trovarsi's question. Yes, the Axis crossfade can run at audio rates, and I have found that the analog crossfaders can indeed do that. Yeah, Analog Kid's answering some questions. The different crossfade modules do have different ways of combining the waveforms. There's a so-called equal power mix that assumes the two input sounds are very different, and therefore actually adds a little bump in the middle so that they don't phase cancel and lose some level in the middle. And then there's what's called a linear crossfade. And linear says, I'm just going to do a straight 50-50% mix at the middle. When you're using something like an oscillator, where the waveforms may already be perfectly phase aligned, an equal power crossfader that adds a little boost in volume in the middle of the crossfade may give you a little bit of overdrive, or a little bit of clipping, or at least a change in volume level during the crossfade. So if I'm mixing together waveforms from one oscillator, I would probably start with a linear crossfade, just so that the volume level will be smooth across the crossfade. That's because we know the waveforms coming in are already phase aligned. But then when I start getting more interesting, detuning, multiple oscillators, oscillators tuned to different musical intervals, wavetable oscillators, then you might find that a crossfade that has an equal power crossfade may give you a smoother response. Or at the very least, it might give you some overdrive in the middle of the crossfade, which might also be interesting. Yeah, other people are recommending some other modules like Morph 4. There's a couple modules like even there's a Mixer, I tend to use the Verbo Scan and Pan. They can take 4 inputs and blend in between those underneath CV control. I understand that there's a quad VCA, maybe the Maleco, that can also do scanning. There is certainly a Make Noise module that could also do that sort of scanning between up to 6 inputs. So there are other modules that will allow you to go beyond just 2 sources, to mix together 3, 4, 6 sources at a time. I didn't want to make everyone's heads explode within 1 hour, so I started with just a simple case of just a 2-input crossfader, because you do need that third signal coming into it to modulate the crossfade to start getting really interesting sounds. I think we're caught up with the chat tab. I think our Italian hosts may be having a well-deserved break, so I don't have much else to share with you. I will let you know that I am other places in social media underneath the Learning Modular name. I do have a website, learningmodular.com, that has a modular synthesis glossary, particularly useful for newbies. Lots of articles on things like dealing with synchronization, dealing with tuning, choosing filters, what's the difference between, say, FM through 0 FM, amplitude modulation, ring modulation. There's videos and articles on that website. I do have several courses online as well, starting at beginner level up through advanced level. Also, of course, from the Mother 32 in specific. And for those who really like hardcore synthesis techniques like this, I do have a Patreon channel, patreon.com/learningmodular, where that's the first place I try out crazy ideas like this on more advanced users. We're playing around with other ideas like how to mix LFO waveforms to get more complex waveforms. I have another idea I'm playing with now of using a filter tracking an oscillator to act as a wave shaper for the oscillator. Not enveloped, but just to further modify the waveforms. And that's another thing I'm going to be writing about soon on Patreon. So that's the type of synthesis techniques I like playing with and experimenting with.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for your explanation. I think you have said everything that could be said. It was very, very interesting. I really liked your way to speak, and I guess there is nothing more to say. You can visit, of course, Chris' website and social media page, so you can find any other information, like we have already said.
Possiamo anche ricordare che abbiamo lo sconto
Assolutamente.
sulla pagina di Chris. Trovate molte informazioni riguardo a Learning Modular, che è la sua piattaforma con i corsi, come avete visto, sui modulari.
Anche sulla sua pagina Patreon, come abbiamo detto.
Sul suo profilo Facebook. Insomma, Chris è raggiungibile sui social molto facilmente. Il sito suo è learningmodular.com. E appunto visitate la sua pagina sul nostro sito del Soundmit per approfittare dello sconto sul suo corso introduttivo alla sintesi modulare. Diciamo che è tutto. Salutiamo Chris. Bye Chris.
Bye, thank you very much. Enjoy the concert a little bit later tonight and have a great day tomorrow.
Okay, yeah. You too. It was a pleasure.
Ciao, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
E noi siamo arrivati
alla conclusione.
Alla conclusione, dopo quante ore di streaming? Credo quasi 8 ore.
7-8 ore
sì,
quasi.
Devo dire che non pensavo che fosse così dura, perché alla fine è particolare, impegnativa, insomma. Ma il Soundbit non finisce qui per 2 motivi. Allora, alle 9, se vi connettete al nostro canale YouTube, quindi youtube.com/Soundmit, inizieranno i live in collaborazione con Modulism di Philippe Petit, quindi Benj, Doug Linner e Illusion of Safety. Ci sarà anche un live di Kim Bjorn, di cui è appena uscito il libro, abbiamo visto passare la sua presentazione nelle promo, e ci saranno ben 6 artisti da Genova Modulare, quindi attenzione, anzi controllo, sì, Genova Modulare. Quindi attenzione, perché fino a mezzanotte comunque il Soundmit continua con la musica. La diretta si chiude qui, ci vediamo domani mattina alle 11 meno qualche minuto, perché abbiamo Roland con Gianni Proietti che ci spiegherà alcune novità della casa appunto giapponese con il Zencore e tutta la parte di software integrata. Quindi domani mattina alle 11, stasera alle 9 tutti i concerti, ma vi ricordo l'ultima cosa, poi stacchiamo. I boot rimangono tutti aperti e visitabili, quindi andate a trovare i nostri espositori.
Approfittate soprattutto dei loro sconti.
Esatto, approfittate degli sconti, ci sono molte promozioni sul DUI, sugli Eurorack, sui corsi online come quello di Chris e ovviamente sul mondo dei sintetizzatori. Io vi saluto qui, ci salutiamo
e ci rivediamo domani tutti al Soundmit.
Ciao a tutti e grazie.